Time for Type 40, your Doctor Who podcast from the Spacebook for the Fandom Podcast Network, with me, Dan Hadley, Birmingham's king of the geeks, designated driver, mouth runner, but a nice, good and keen listener. Here's where we deliver Doctor Who conversation, facts, views, banter, and who knows what, fit for marking this 60th anniversary year on our free-speaking, big-thinking show for everyone. Whatever decade or century you started watching, reading, or listening along to those ongoing adventures of our hero, Doctor Who. We talk about it all on this show, eventually, and there could even be a few laughs along the way. So come and step into our TARDIS and share this journey together here with us on Type 40. This one's positively packed with faces, or more accurately, voices. One or two you'll absolutely know, and perhaps one you're more accustomed to hear the words of, put in other actors' mouths and put before readers too, in books and audio drama. All that's coming right up. Get ready for a trip back to the 80s and the 90s and the early noughties. Actually, I think we're everywhere. I'm all over the place, as always, and we are everywhere all at once, as befits a Doctor Who podcast. All will be revealed in a moment. In the meantime, if you'd like to do some real-time travelling of your own, each and every edition of this show, past, present, and future, is just a tap or two away on the device of your choice, but only if you know where to look. There's masses of great conversations, reviews, previews, interviews, geek-outs, and deep dives with all our regulars and some pretty awesome guests. In fact, we know there's something for every fan over at type40.podbean.com. More about that later on, as well as a couple of minutes, as always, where we will make contact with that matrix of all knowledge that we call the Fandom Podcast Network. Listen out for that. Be ready to make a few mental notes. Right, I think that's enough drum roll, even for me. What's the definition of an historical figure? Ask the average person to name some, and you're going to get your Winston Churchills, Florence Nightingales, maybe a Napoleon or two, and certainly a plethora of William Shakespeare's. Now, maddeningly, to the families and friends of us Doctor Who fans, we name and certainly talk about people associated with the show who have since passed on just as regularly and any chance we get. We're a strange breed, or maybe not, because whether it's George Best or C.S. Lewis or David Bowie or whoever else, the truth is, as the dictionary says, in fact, that the actual definition of an historical figure is simply one whose deeds exerted a significant impact on other people's lives and consciousness. And as producer of more classic Doctor Who than anyone else, John Nathan Turner, who was on the show between 1980 and 1989. Wow. Well, there's no bigger a figure in Doctor Who than him. And John's been the subject of two high-profile yet very different books just this last few years, and a feature-length documentary. And now UK studios add to that legacy in yet another unique way, with a completely original scripted drama penned by someone who was a personal friend of the late producer, and it's just been released. Me and Him and Who offers a poignant and timely study of John's later years. And I'm happy to say that on this edition of Type 40, I'm joined not only by Stephen Wyatt, the writer, but actor Christopher Guard, who's playing John Nathan Turner, and producer Barnaby Eaton-Jones. They're all here to tell us some more. Gentlemen, welcome to Type 40.
Thank you.
Hello.
That was very voice artisty there, Barnaby. Very throaty one, yeah. So, Stephen, I'm going to start with you I'll start with you, if I may, because as Doctor Who fans, of course, we've seen your name on the credits of two of the most idiosyncratic stories of the later years of the classic show. But the truth of the matter is they're just part of a career for you, aren't they? In writing for TV, theatre, and crucially, in this case, radio and audio drama. aren't they? This is a completely different kind of story that you're bringing to our ears this time. I think a lot of people are going to find this irresistible, but what's the genesis of Me and Him and Who?
Well, it's quite simple, really. I was on holiday with my partner sometime in March, and he said to me, "Why don't you do something about John Nathan Turner?" And I thought, well, I'm sure it's been done. I mean, there must have been done, you know. And so my first stop, I went, I talked to Richard Marson, because I knew, although I knew John very well, I had to have Richard Marson's book behind me, because it's the definitive book about JNT, and it has so much research in it. So I talked to him, and he basically said, "There's nobody else is doing this at the moment," and gave me his blessing. Indeed, he's been incredibly generous and supportive throughout the whole process. And then I emailed Barnaby and said, "What about it?" And he immediately expressed interest. And during our discussions, we realized it made more sense as a piece if it became a two-hander. So it involved not just JNT himself, but also his long-term partner, Gary Downie. And well, that was the starting point, really.
Had you got a pre-established working relationship then between yourself and Barnaby, Stephen?
Not really, had we? We've talked about lots of projects and passed the time of day on Facebook and things like that. But this, I think, is the first project we've actually brought to fruition together. But I just knew that, one, it was a very good chance that he would be interested, and two, he's the sort of person, if he's interested, he'll get it done.
And Barnaby, it's safe. Yeah, well, it's safe to say, Barnaby, that you do seem to be a man who has this track record of getting things done. You've been very prolific over the last few years, haven't you, with a whole range of audio dramas. So when Stephen came to you with this project, were you initially very interested in this, or did you understand it? Were you aware of John Nathan Turner and Gary, for that matter? What were the lights that came on when you heard of this?
Yeah, no. Well, The Greatest Show in the Galaxy, which Stephen wrote for Doctor Who, the TV series, is one of my favorite Doctor Who stories. So I knew of Stephen, from when I was really young. And then it's lovely. I think the great thing about Doctor Who is, if you're a fan, you end up being a fan of lots of other things, because you follow an actor, or you follow a writer, or you follow a director, and you end up, your vision expands exponentially because of Doctor Who, which is lovely. And so I had commissioned a script from Stephen just before, because I adored a book that he wrote, and I said we should turn that into an audio. And so he very kindly did that. But then, because just for whatever reasons we haven't quite got that one into production, then obviously this one seemed a no-brainer. And it was, it's amazing. John Nathan Turner's such a massive character, and someone who, for me, deserves reappraisal all the time, because he got a lot of stick at the time for his decisions, and for his views, and for where he was taking the show. But he kept the show on the air, and I mean, it's quite amazing, really, what he did. So and to have that, two-hander between him and his partner, which I think most Doctor Who fans will know, is Gary was a sort of also a big part of the relationship. So it was a really, really good idea. So I just thought, well, we should get this done really, and do it as quick as we can. I don't like doing anything slow. It's like, well, let's do this really quickly, and off we go.
You sound as driven as JNT was. She's certainly very industrious. But this is the thing, isn't it? Because over the years, over the decades, and I think that obviously the books that have come out, and the Showman, the recent documentary film, have done a lot to expand our understanding of JNT and his life and his work, and the man himself, really. But with projects like this, I suppose you can peel some of the myth away and focus on a real human being, because he was driven, wasn't he? He was a complicated man. He was very energetic and strident and very funny, but has this reputation of being quite, for as playful as he was quite petulant too, and a very flawed person, as are we all. So I suppose when this project came together. Sorry, Stephen, what were you going to say?
Because the interesting thing, and the difficult thing, is he was all those things you said. He was very driven, he was very imaginative, but at 43, he was made redundant at the BBC, and all he had to his credit was Doctor Who. And, you know, he spent a lot of time over the next 10 years trying to get other projects going. You know, he did pantos, but basically he remained dependent on Doctor Who. You know, that he was doing conventions, he was doing shows, he was doing signings. And so I think the interesting thing of what we've tried to do is to look at what happened to him after Doctor Who, and how he and Gay are trying to make sense of their lives, and they both become seriously ill. And so that was the perspective that we wanted to look at. And John never totally lost that extraordinary brilliance. I mean, I've got an email from him 3 months before he died, in which he's talking about, I'm going to do this, we're going to do that, and my treatment is going well. He never quite gave up, but it was a huge, huge struggle, and an increasingly difficult struggle for both of them. That
must be, as somebody who knew them and who witnessed it, it must have been difficult to witness. Well,
my mum and dad lived very close to the Saltine, and I used, when I was staying with my mum and dad, to pop over for tea and cakes, which was very jolly. And John, being a sweetheart, would send slices of cake back for my mum and dad, and this was all very, very nice. And then gradually the atmosphere changed, and no tea and cakes. It was just vodka and orange, and literally just vodka and orange. I mean, I went over once for tea. 5 hours later, all I'd been offered was vodka and orange, and I was feeling rather ill, to say the least. And I sort of begged a cup of coffee just to get me, because my parents were no longer living there, to get back on the bus to get myself home. And I just couldn't keep up with this. I mean, I like a drink, but this was really like.
I mean, yeah. To look at a project like this, as you say, a two-hander. It's a lot to put onto. It's a lot to put into an hour's worth of scripted drama. Anyway, I would think to take your experiences and the lives of two men and their relationship, their intimate relationship, and to sort of to boil that down in an appropriate way. I would imagine, Barnaby, that the choosing of the right actors for both parts was essential, and that's why I want to bring in Christopher here, Christopher Guard. Now, Doctor Who fans will recognise you as a cast member of Stephen's second story, wouldn't they? The Barnaby mentioned it earlier on, The Greatest Show in the Galaxy. You played Bellboy, didn't you, in that?
Yeah, well, I believe so. Yeah. Yeah.
But it was a memorable, tragic character, wasn't he, Christopher? And one that really has stayed with the viewers. But again, this was just one role in a very long and varied career that you've had as a singer, a musician, an artist, and an actor, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I was born into a family of actors, writers, one or two musicians hanging around the edges, and the house when I was young was full of people like everyone from Richard Briers to Flanders and Swan to Dennis Quilley to, I'm just dropping names now. It was also full of people who weren't famous at all. And,
good names though, Chris, good names.
And psychopathic dogs, and we had so many animals. I don't know why. It was, you know, we were self-employed, you know, crazy, busy household, and loads of animals as well. But yeah, you know, I played David Copperfield on telly when I was 12. I wasn't a child actor, really, because it was just something that came up, and I did that. And then that character was played when he was older by a 26-year-old Ian McKellen, which was interesting. Nobody kind of really knew who Ian was. He was very good in it, and that was the beginning for me. I'd never really decided to be an actor, and I still haven't really. I still diversify. You know, I write. I've just written a book. This is why I work with Barnaby. I've written a sort of kaleidoscopic, eccentric sort of memoir about particularly my early life and growing up. that's how we became connected. This tome here, which
I
Barnaby
see.
Barnaby immediately sort of got it. He got my eclectic style and my way of approaching how I remember things and bring it all into the present.
Just
So
seems
yeah,
very
so
creatively led life, Chris.
well, yes and no. I mean, it also includes running on football pitches at Craven Cottage and playing knockdown ginger and getting twin rover tickets and generally misbehaving. I mean, it's been a life of, I don't know, really. It's hard to pin it down. But I think the main thing has been, it's like most people's lives, I suppose. It's never really been very easy to foresee. And I remember they asked me a question at a little convention we did for The Greatest Show a few years ago, and somebody asked me something like, after all these years, were you expecting all to be here again together? To which I said, yes. Because that's the nature of Doctor Who. You never know quite where you're going to land next.
I suppose not.
I had no idea that this is what was going to happen with Doctor Who. I said, I wrote these 2 shows about 35 years ago now. Doctor Who ended. I really thought that was that. And to me, it's quite extraordinary how many projects have come up about this. I mean,
it won't go away, will it? It just
won't go. I've ceased to complain or grumble. I mean, excuse me, I've done this. Well, surely there are more important things in my life than Doctor Who, and I've now accepted it'll be on my gravestone. He wrote for
no, well, absolutely. No, the same with me, Stephen. I mean, I as you may recall, I did your classic serials on telly and played leads opposite, considerable people. You're on the front of magazines and all that type of stuff, and nobody remembers any of it.
Well, I remember, Chris. I remember.
They do want you to sign Doctor Who photographs. I've
been looking into it, and I've seen. Obviously, you were Stephen. With you wrote for Casualty and the House of Elliot on television, didn't you? And you've done lots of theatre and radio work. I mean, it's been a big part of your career, I understand. And Chris, you too. We spoke earlier on about the various hats that you've worn. You've been in so many TV shows that were part of the fabric of British culture. You were in Lovejoy, Casualty again, Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes, Treasure Island with Brian Blessed, all these shows. But you're no stranger to voice work either, are you? And so when it comes to this particular project, and when you were approached about it, were you very interested initially, or did it have to have a certain combination of qualities for you to say yes, I'll do that? I'll do that script. Well,
no, I've always liked voice work. I mean, I partly because you don't have to learn any lines, which I like voice work and. Filming days when all you have to do is ride around on horses and look kind of intense and meaningful, but not necessarily say anything. So from that perspective, I like it. I also, I've always enjoyed. I did quite a lot of Jack and Norries back in the day, and I've always enjoyed reading to my kids. I like just getting the words off the page and making them come to life. So I genuinely enjoy audio. And this particularly, I mean, obviously, because, I knew John when he was an AFM. I knew him when he was putting on it was some show in the West End. He was a humble AFM, and he managed to get all these kind of big stars into this. It was a pantomime, I think, at a West End theatre. And I'm thinking, how is he doing this? And it was the drive and the kind of playful, willful, impish, I will not be moved attitude that he brought to so many things. And he got this huge show on. And there were Peter O'Toole and Sean Phillips and all these types. And I thought, who is this? Who is this chap who seemingly believes he can make anything happen? And that was, kind of, I think that was what he brought to Who as well. He had this defining, willfulness, for want of a better word. He didn't like the word no. So
the combination of someone such as yourself, Chris, who'd known John for considerably longer, since before he was on Doctor Who, and then you, Stephen, who remained his friend, it sounds like, until his death. So between you, you've got a lot of these aspects of his life, his work, his personality covered. So
Yeah.
So in many ways, Barnaby, is this a gift to you to come across an actor like Chris here, who didn't just work with the man once, who actually personally knew him as well? They had a relationship. So did you go to Chris with an idea about how you wanted him to play it, or was it somewhere you reached between the two of you?
That was really fortuitous, because obviously Chris mentioned his memoir, which I was publishing through my little Chinbeard Books publishing company, and it just happened to be coinciding with obviously Stephen saying, "Hey, we should do this audio about John Nathan Turner." And then, you know, once you read the script and you can hear John Nathan Turner and Gary's voices quite clearly in it, and then you've got to try and match that to actors that can bring it to life. And it doesn't necessarily have to be, you know, a pitch perfect vocal impersonation. And sometimes that's worse, because you can hear, you know, somebody impersonating rather than somebody actually giving the character what they need. And so Chris just came to mind straight away, sent him the script. He was over the moon, you know, to be able to do it. And he said the very same thing. I'm not going to do an impersonation. I'm going to, you know, bring the character out and be the man rather than, you know, be the exact voice, which worked incredibly well. And it was difficult to find somebody that he could play across. And I just happened to be, again, very lucky that the chap called Peter Noble, who I'd connected with on Twitter, who's a brilliant voice actor, has done loads of audio books and stuff, but he's actually from South Africa. And so when I talked to him about the background of Gary, the first thing he said was, I instantly know that character. I know who that person is, because I was around, you know, these ballet dancers in South Africa and stuff, and I know that world, and so I can get his voice, and I know his character, which was brilliant. So, you know, it was an easy job for me, because once you've cast two people, you know, that can do that, and Stephen's writing is, you know, very easy to bring off the page because it's so delicious to be able to act it, then it's, you know, I don't really have to do that much after then. It's just, you know, getting it recorded and getting it edited. I mean, it's just it's a bit of alchemy sometimes, where you just happen to have all the right things in the same place, and it ends up being, you know, more than the sum of its parts, which is brilliant. And that's hopefully what happened with this. I hope when people listen to it, that's what they'll feel.
I often say on this show, Barnaby, how our connections as fans of shows such as Doctor Who or Robin of Sherwood or any of the other things that you're familiar with, they can often be very, very personal, because they've been formed in our own family homes through the television set. That's simply how it works. But obviously they're very fantastical worlds and fantastical stories. But this, on the other hand, is so personal, so intimate. Was this a handbrake turn for you as a producer? Or did you approach it in a different way, or is it actually a lot more similar than perhaps the likes of us who listen to this stuff, that we may be aware?
Well, I love there's the difference, isn't there? I've done a couple of
a story is a story, I suppose many would say, but
yeah, and it is a sometimes, especially if you're doing you know, audios or you know, whatever production about a real person, the drama element is what sort of hooks you in, and then if you can add a bit of comedy, sprinkle a bit of comedy on top of that, then it's always lovely. But I've done a couple of imagined scenarios of, you know, not necessarily famous people, but, you know, interesting couples. And I thought when Stephen came, because as Stephen said, he came with this originally as a monologue, so it would have just been John Nathan Turner talking, and so that was different in itself. And I think had it been or if it was a shorter play, that we could have done that. But just because I wanted it a little bit longer, then obviously Stephen was very happy to let's get, you know, Gary, and so we can bounce off. We got those two characters rather than just the one, and that's what I think, because it's a longer audio, it holds the interest in the fact that you're then exploring their relationship properly, rather than just sort of, you know, John Nathan Turner's final years. And so it's, yeah, I mean, it was just I always, there's a Tom Baker quote, so I don't know what the quote is exactly, but he always said that, you know, his resurgence in his career was because people that watched him as the Doctor had grown into, you know, jobs where they could then employ him, because that's what they loved. And there is that element of us who loved, you know, certain actors or certain series or stuff, we get to enjoy being able to say to those people that we absolutely massively admired, can you come and do this? And then they create something equally brilliant again, and you just get to be part of that, rather than, you know, than you were as a child. But as an adult, you get to sort of experience it in a whole new different way. So that was, you know, that's always in the back of your mind a little bit, and that's why it's been a joy to work with Stephen and Chris on this, because having been a fan, you get to experience firsthand what they really truly can bring to everything, which is brilliant.
Yeah. And if I could just add, you know, in Barnaby's praise, I mean, he talked about doing things quickly, and I think that is that's a kind of genius in itself, not to hesitate and think, well, hang on a minute, I could spend another 3 or 4 days thinking about this and thinking of other people. But if a few little things pop into your head and they fit, why hesitate? So I mean, that's what I got off it, and that's why, although I was a little nervous about inhabiting John, it was the kind of synchronicity, spontaneity of the way it came together, which really gave it the instant appeal. Yeah.
Does it help that you knew? Well, you both gentlemen, you've worked with Stephen before and with Barnaby before. Was it helpful that you had confidence in their abilities, in Stephen's words and Barnaby's skills as well, to give you everything you would need, to not have your performance drift into some sort of caricature, to be something that could have truth that you could tap into?
Yeah, well, you know, I think it's not so much the experiences of working with people as the fact that you trust their integrity. I think that's what it was about.
Yeah.
So it didn't take a lot of talking, really. It just was like, you know, yeah, okay, let's do it. And I didn't have any hesitation, really. I mean, Stephen, you know, you can admire people. I admire Barnaby, I admire Stephen, but I haven't, you know, worked extensively with either of them, really. And apart from, you know, on the book with Barnaby, and obviously Greatest Show with Stephen. But that's enough, you know. I mean, how many times do you need to ask yourself whether you like or trust or admire a person? You know, once is usually enough.
Stephen, earlier on when you mentioned this, how the project came to mind, it's amusing the fact that you said you were talking to your partner. How about this? How about that? I don't know if you're sort of condensing things down to make it a good anecdote or not, but probably best that we don't know. But how long did it take you to actually? How long did it take you to write the entire piece in the end?
Oh, I can't actually remember. It wasn't very long, because the whole press, I'm going to say, you know, if you worked at the BBC Radio, we would still be discussing the draft or something I proposed in March. And it would probably be out some point in June 2024. And here we are. I said to Barnaby sometime in March, what about it? And here we are. The thing is out and ready and alive by December, which is absolutely brilliant. I think I just want to go back and say, because I think it's quite interesting, is that, I mean, everybody talks about Joe and T, but for me, almost as interesting in writing it was finding out about Gary. Because actually, I mean, the truth was, and it's said again and again, not many people liked Gary. John was a very popular person. He had lots of friends. Most of them found Gary very, very hard work. He was waspish, shall we say. He was not almost appropriate in his behavior towards people. And so to me, one of the big challenges of the piece was trying to find out what made him tick, and also what was the basis of their relationship. And it was odd, because during the time I knew them, I remember going there one day, and Gary came in halfway and I was chatting to John, and they said, how did your counselling course go? And I, like many other people, going, Gary Downie is doing a counselling course. You know, he was the last person you would think of to have that sort of patience. And I said to that point that what that was about, in part, was that he was having to take care of John. The whole power thing had started to shift. John had always been the big producer. Gary was always, the floor manager or the hanger-on or whatever. And John was, losing his confidence, he'd lost his way, really. And at that point, Gary, I think, became much more to the forefront. I mean, he'd obviously always been a very important support for J&T, but I think at this point it became much more apparent. And so that was something I thought was interesting to explore in the piece, that behind all the bitchery and the cavalry, as seen here, they were actually, there was a depth to their relationship and the way they looked after each other, which showed at this point at which they both became seriously ill. And so that's the sort of underlying part of the script that really interested me to explore, rather than just, and so Barnaby's instinct originally to make it into a two-hander was absolutely right. I think it gave whole new dimensions to it.
Real opportunity for you to get into the weeds there as a writer, and to not do justice to Gary as such, but to expand on our perceptions of who this man was. I think you're right. He has got this. He cuts a bit of a not a shadowy figure. That's unfair. But he's almost this presence. It's John Nathan Turner and Gary Downie. He's also a name on some credits. John was so flamboyant, so vibrant, very much the showman. I went to a couple of conventions where John acted as a kind of master of ceremonies in some respects to certain components of the events. Now, I'm not convinced that he'd actually been booked in that capacity at all of them. I think he probably had in one or two, but certainly not all of them. He just took to the floor. He in a very natural sort of way, and I think he enjoyed the spotlight almost as much as he would have done had he been an actor or any other. I think he just enjoyed. I think he enjoyed the company of other people. He seemed to feed off the energy of people. I think he seemed to enjoy making people smile too. And I think that when the fans come back to him and told him how much they enjoyed what he did, I mean, and this was at any time in his history on the show or afterwards, you see on pictures, you see his face just lighting up.
Yes, I mean, I think so. There's sort of two things to say about that. I mean, one which is just going back to Gary for the moment. On what we're asking, people found him very difficult. You can't write a character unless you understand them. And you don't have to think they're great people or they're wonderful people. You just have to find something about what made them tick and why this relationship worked for them. So that was but your other point about the showmanship, I mean, I think this is absolutely true. I mean, there's all that stuff about the fact that, which I put into the play, the deep distrust that the upper management of the BBC had of John because he was a showman. He went off to all these conventions, he promoted the show in a way which at that point nobody did. It was a bit sort of vulgar, a bit sort of naff. I mean, now you can't move for promotions everywhere in every way possible, but John was very much the pioneer. I mean, opening up the American markets and things like that. And the tragedy was that he retained those abilities, but after he finished Who, he really had nowhere to put them, of any lasting interest to him or anybody else. He was just
to give both Peter and Chris this script, but was it something that you then you didn't just hand it over to them? Was it something that you had? There was a lot of communication between you all, really, as the project was being recorded. Did you adjust much of it along the way? For example, depending on what how can I put this? What Chris was latching onto in his performance, did it require any refinement along the way from either of you, Chris? Did you find that?
No, I mean, not really. I think it was one of those ones where, I just trusted the script. I immediately found the writing it's got an intensity about it. It's like little shiny little knots that then unravel, and Yeah, it's got. I just immediately thought, well, I know Stephen can write, you know, and I immediately thought, well, this is cool. The only thing I was worried about was, as I say, inhabiting John's shoes. Just to add,
That's what I wondered, because I wondered if your memories of working with him and knowing him conflicted at all with Stephen's, and that's what
I don't know. I think more. I mean, I knew Gary when I was 19. I played Flashman in a musical production of Tom Brown's School Days at the Cambridge Theatre in London, with, among others, Simon Le Bon playing Boys from Rugby School, Russell Grant the astrologer playing my sidekick Slugger, and there was this very tough, as West End dancers tended to be. It's a very, very tough profession, and you know, you're physically very fit. And Gary was the assistant choreographer to an American guy called Leo Caribbean. It was directed by Peter Coe, who had directed Oliver. And I remember Gary being, I don't know, he was okay, really. He was tough, you know, he was tough on the kids. But that was the nature of the job. You're there to get people moving and doing stuff, and he could be pretty difficult. But when I'd also known John when I was fairly young, when he was an AFM around North Acton rehearsal rooms on various productions. So when they became an item, or I was aware of the fact that they were an item, it was quite a shock to me. And I think very often in life, you can look at a person and think, oh, he's such a sweetie, but what's he doing with that awful so-and-so? Or, oh, God, she's lovely, but what on earth did she marry him for? Well, you know, it's not our job to legislate for that. You know, we all know, you know, what constitutes a relationship can be really quite complex, and you just have to sort of let it be, I think. And so I was cool with them together. I thought they were all right. And just one other thing, as a little boy playing David Copperfield, that was directed by the legendary Joan Craft, who was gay, and her partner Jane Shirley always worked with her, like John and Gary working together. Everybody loved Joan. Jane was she was the one being the tough one, ordering the cameramen around, shouting and yelling. Everybody hated her. But they worked together well, both as professionals and as a couple. So I'd had an early experience of that kind of symbiosis feeding into, you know, both the professional and the personal life.
Do you think that John lent on Gary more than anybody could have known, either any colleagues of theirs at the time, and certainly any fans? There was something between them, a dynamic between them, and that was something that, again, that yourself and Peter could latch onto.
I personally think that was probably the case. You know, we never knew, do we? I mean, when you and I were talking earlier about when a relationship falls apart, you know, it's not just, you know, the one person and another person, it's the two people together. And even when you don't realize it, you're subconsciously relying on another person's input, their feelings, their opinions, and they're always there to say, hey, I think I might have made a bit of a mistake today. What do you think of this? Or whatever it happens to be. So I think the answer to that question is yes.
There's for all that this is an attempt to sort of to bring something really, really real and raw, and something as common as a domestic relationship to people's ears. You know, we've all been in domestic relationships of one form or another, whether we've been married or not, or in long-term relationships or not. So there's that aspect to it, but there's an inherent dreamlike quality, I feel, to audio drama. I listen to quite a lot of it, and in enabling someone such as yourself, Chris, to channel all of that and to conjure up something else, something from you, and to embody and communicate their story and their characters, tooled with your words, Stephen, you know, and then offer it to an audience through Barnaby's production. I think the audience, we as listeners, what we bring is the balance. Pictures that we all see a different production in our heads to whatever it is that we're listening to, and I suppose it's the same whether it's some big expansive fantasy drama or something like this, a two-hander. But I think it is something like this. What I wanted to ask really was to you, Barnaby, is a story like this actually, does this make for the best audio drama, to boil it down to what it's really good at?
Yeah, it's the intimacy, isn't it? I was going to say earlier about Stephen's script is that it would have been very easy to make the characters black and white. You know, there's the evil Gary and the lovely John, and that would have been, you know, some other writer may have done that. But the fact that Stephen actually spent time sorting Gary's character out in his head and going, you know, he wasn't all bad. He was there for a reason. They loved each other, and this is what, you know, this is the sort of relationship that they were in, and they supported each other through those horrendous times, you know, when they were both incredibly unwell, and John couldn't get another job after Doctor Who. I mean, that's what is fascinating, is it's such an intricate, intimate script rather than just, you know, some two big caricatures. It's these real people, and with audio, because, you know, you hear those voices straight into your ears, you know, that is the sort of intimacy of it, is that you're like a fly on the wall listening to these conversations going on, you know, within the room that they're supposed to be going on in, or within the garden, or what have you. And that's what's fascinating. It's very, you know, on audio, it's the lovely thing about audio is that you can do humongous space operas, or you can do, you know, World War II on audio, and these big things, because you're, you know, there's the sound effects and the music, and your brain will conjure up the images. But then to boil it right back to just these two people speaking, and the fact that, you know, you're on a journey with them in those last 3 years of their life, that's what's, you know, fascinating, because you're it's like you're there with them, and that's what this was, such a great script, and brought out great performances, because it was you know, it was twisty, turny, and interesting. You didn't, you know, I mean, you know, if you're a Doctor Who fan, you know what's going to happen at the end, obviously in a bizarre way, but you don't know how you're going to get there. So and hopefully it'll bring, you know, a little bit more understanding about that little, you know, era where John clearly was lambasted by a huge group of fans, when really all he ever wanted to do was keep the series alive for those people that were lambasting him. So it's yeah, I mean, it's brilliant writing, and the performances, you know, we're able to showcase that. So it was a privilege,
I think
to
in
be
a
able
way,
to.
Chris?
So I was just going to say, in a way, you know, that's credit to the writing, and also to your, you know, trust in the actors you chose, is that sometimes it was almost like no acting required. Although John was flamboyant and big and all that, it kind of just, the writing informed the performance to such an extent that I found it relatively, not easy, but, you know, and the parts where he's, you know, I was completely choked up. I mean, when I was doing the tricky stuff with the, you know, he's crying really. And I didn't have to say, oh, this is the bit where I cry. I was genuinely moved by saying these words, that with the memories of John, this flamboyant, you know, lover of life and phenomenal person in the back of my head, and you're playing these very, very sad moments, which are beautifully written. So I kind of just had to inhabit the script really, rather than interpret it.
Stephen, what do you enjoy the most about writing this kind of work? Because it does sound somewhat theatrical as well, and you've written a lot of theatre too. So what do you get out of this? Obviously, there was there's a factor to exploring a relationship between two people you knew pretty well. That must have been a bit of a journey of discovery for you two in that respect. But what do you get out of this kind of work as a writer? What are the disciplines that it demands?
Well, I'm very fond of radio. I've done radio from this small all the way through. I mean, my craziest project ever is I did Dante's The Divine Comedy in 3 parts for Radio 4, which was just insane. You know, it was sort of like people say, are you really going to do this? And we did, and it was fantastic. I loved it. And so many people said to me, well, we've all read Purgatorio, but nobody's ever got through. So we're all going to be in Inferno. We never got through Purgatorio, and as for Paradiso. So people were quite grateful for me to be able to get to the end of the poem. But I think what I'm saying is that the key thing for me about radio is you just have to remember it's taking place inside your head, not in front of your eyes. And that's the way in which people complete it for themselves is very different. You know, and in fact, that is its power. There is an extra element, because listening to audio drama is a much more, okay, people do sit around together, but by and large, it's a much more intimate experience.
It's not as passive as television, is it? Because it does demand something from the listener more.
It requires you, yes, it requires you to become involved. I say it's inside your head what you're taking in, and you are completing it in a way.
It's a halfway house, isn't it, between reading a book and seeing a film or a TV, because the words are all being done for you, but the pictures you have to fill in for yourself.
Yes, I mean, I think I felt, you know, doing it compared with, say, television or film writing. In a way, radio drama writing is more like poetry. You're actually, you have to use words very evocatively, very economically, because you've got nothing else to work with. And therefore, you're requiring other people then the listener to complete and participate in a way that they don't have to if they're just sitting watching something.
And does that excite you? Does that interest you? Or is that for them? You're quite happy for them to have that, and whatever they've got in their heads is in their heads. Your part of the job is done.
I think so. I mean, like, you can't anyway control what people make of things. I mean, even if it's a television show, you know, people will look at it, and some people will love it, some people will hate it. I mean, I've always said, you know, if you actually really want to control your vision, you better write a book, because
exactly. Then you're in complete control. Yeah.
So when people come back to you about the audio work that you've done, and they say, "Oh, I imagined it like this, or like that, or like the other, or I heard this, or I tapped into that," does that surprise you, Stephen, when you get those sorts of responses?
No, because I think it's the nature. I think it is actually the nature of. Do
people see things? What I'm saying is that you would never have imagined on occasion.
I've not had that too much. I mean, the thing is, you have to be very careful in audio drama, because a lot of things are more horrible than they would be if you actually saw them. I mean, let me give you an example. I did some adaptations of Patricia Highsmith's Ripley books. And in one scene, Ripley has to fish a rotting corpse out of a pond and drag it across the floor. And honestly, in radio, all this meant was a sack being pulled across the studio floor with a little bit of scotch. But I'm prepared to bet that was infinitely scarier than any visual representation you would ever. I mean, even when we were doing it, we were going, "Oh my God, this is gross." But in fact, there was very little happening. You have to, in a way, to be more economical with how you use sound as well as word. You know, which is, I say, why it's more like poetry. It's more, has to be more controlled, more economical.
It does seem like there's a sort of your trust in Chris and Barnaby to bring their elements into play and to create a full audio drama that you can all be proud of. Art for the ears, I think you can safely say. And there's more art for the ears now, just for a couple of minutes. It's time for us to check in with our mate Kev. He's standing by, as always, with a portfolio full of podcasts that cover all your favourite franchises, all part of the Fandom Podcast Network. You're going to love this trip sideways in time. There'll be more from them and me on Him and It coming up in a couple of minutes. Don't go away.
Thank you for listening. We hope you're enjoying this podcast. Here are the other great shows on the Fandom Podcast Network. Culture Clash, where we discuss the latest in entertainment and pop culture. Blood of Kings, our show covering the entire Highlander universe. Couch Potato Theater, we celebrate our favorite movies. And Time Warp, our Fandom flashback show discussing a year in movies and our favorite retro movie, TV, and pop culture topics. Good evening, discussing all things Alfred Hitchcock. Hair Metal Podcast. We cover the rock metal music of the 80s and early 90s. Type 40, a Doctor Who podcast discussing the time-traveling Doctor Who universe. Lethal Mullet, an action film podcast covering the 80s, 90s, and beyond. Also, check out the Lethal Mullet Network for more great podcasts. What a Piece of Junk, our Star Wars podcast. Making Treks, a Star Trek podcast with a deep dive into the final frontier. The Fandom Show, our Fandom Podcast Network live YouTube show discussing the hottest topics in fandom. The True Believers MCU podcast discussing the Marvel Cinematic and Television Universe. Union Federation, our Star Trek, and the Orville Show. And we're proud to welcome the BQN Network to the Fandom Podcast Network. Please visit our friends on the BQN Network, a Star Trek Universe podcast that also includes your favorite topics, movies, history, superheroes, and more. You can find the Fandom Podcast Network on YouTube. The Fandom Podcast Network is also on all major podcast platforms. The Fandom Podcast Network audio master feed is on Podbean at fpnet.podbean.com. You can find the Fandom Podcast Network on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can email us at fandompodcastnetwork@gmail.com. Thank you so much for listening, and remember, respect others and enjoy your fandom.
Yes, we've teased and tantalized you there, and we can even clothe you too. There's merch to match all of those shows, including Type 40, if you head over to tpublic.com. Search for the Fandom Podcast Network, and you'll find a store full of all the team colours for all of those shows on everything from T-shirts to phone cases and enormous tapestries. Treat yourself, treat your other selves, and it all goes to support the Fandom Podcast Network into the bargain, so everybody wins. We're still here lodged in limbo between Christmas and New Year as I talk to my guests Stephen, Chris and Barnaby as we preview their brand new audio drama, Me and Him and Who. It sounds like it's a project that it's a once in a lifetime kind of production. This story, I can't imagine it could ever be told in this way on any other medium ever again. Your relationships with Jay and Tim, and particularly yours, Chris and Stephen, who knew the guy, obviously are very, very different. But it sounds like they didn't necessarily conflict. What I was wondering though is what Jay and T himself would have made of all of this. It's now 20 years since he passed away. We talked about the mythology surrounding Doctor Who and how it seems to have sort of dogged your career a little, Stephen. And it's something that you've been surprised by too there, Chris. And Barnaby is a fan, you know as well as any of us that it's there, isn't it, throughout your life, isn't it, sort of as a constant companion. But what do you think J&T would have made of it all this time on?
I think it's quite, the answer is I'm not absolutely sure, but I do feel that you have to try and be as honest and faithful to the people you knew as you can possibly be. And my hope would be that John and Gary would recognise, there is truth in the way in which we've depicted them. And the complexity, because I say, on one level.
Do you think he'd be amused and flattered, or feel a little bit exposed at first, or what do you think?
I think he'd be. I hope he'd be flattered first of all, because it would be just simply that he is remembered, and people still have a sense of who he was and what he did. So I would hope so. It's very difficult to know, isn't it, if any of us are confronted with something written about us by somebody else, we would probably have mixed feelings about it.
Yeah, it's hard for me to imagine.
Yeah,
it's hard to imagine. And go on, sorry, Chris.
No, I was just going to say, I think John wanted to carry on, as we can tell from the play. I think he hated being sick. I mean, he did drink a lot, and as a lot of people around the BBC, and theatre and everything else did in the 70s and into the 80s, it was more prevalent than it is now, and it was more acceptable to be, oh, what should we do at lunchtime? Oh, we're going to have a few drinks. And I think he did, in a rock and roll way, really use booze quite a lot to drive him forward, to get him through the difficult moments, to give him courage, and so on and so forth. So in that respect, I don't. What I'm saying is, I don't really think he would personally particularly celebrate the way his life turned out. But I do think he would completely understand and admire the way that Stephen has been very honest and truthful about it. I think it has the quintessence of it is very it's all there. It's all there.
Because he did have other ideas and other projects that he was not desperate to get into production, but was certainly very, very, very keen to get the wheels moving on. He wasn't just a one-trick pony, was he? He had other ambitions. He was, as you said, he was very young to be kind of retired, pensioned off by the BBC in some respects. You can see why it hit him as hard as it did.
He was an impresario, really. He had a theatrical impresario's nature about him, which did, in the corridors of Threshold House, where people could be quite, shoulders round and, I don't know, just not as expansive as John. Even directors like Herbie Wise and Alan Bridges, all these great TV directors I had the pleasure to work with. I mean, they none of them, and the producers as well, I can't remember anybody who had that theatricality as much as John did. So it was singular.
And those qualities, as you described there, Chris, and everything that you said earlier on there, Stephen, do you think, Barnaby, that someone like Gary, we talked about the fact that Gary moved into counselling, which I'm sure he didn't take that on lightly either, but do you think that he would have perhaps found it easier to move on than someone like John could? I get the impression that John felt there was a lot of unfinished business, and if not resentment, then perhaps something that needed to be proven, whereas Gary, it was perhaps a little cleaner for him.
Yeah, I think you can tell, because having been at that position, you would assume that you will be able to get your next project off the ground with you wouldn't have to take a step down to do stuff. And I think that's what John found difficult, is that he couldn't get things off the ground that he expected would be quite easy sort of to do so, because he did bridge that gap between theatre and between television. So he did do theatrical stuff, and even there, he couldn't just go straight back into that and do, because you have to raise finances and etc. I just think it's sad that he wasn't able to stick around long enough to see the resurgence of Doctor Who, because everything that came out with the new Doctor Who would have been the type of things that he would have encouraged, to promote the show, to keep it alive, to keep it in everybody's minds. I mean, it's clear that Russell T Davies, had one eye on that sort of period that John produced the show, because he has all of that, special guest, big name guest stars, get writers that are good at what they do. Let's promote it as much as we can, link it in with this, that, and the other. I mean, it's sort of classic John Nathan Turner, isn't it, really? Even down to the fact that he's got 3 initials in his name as well. I don't think he did that on purpose. No, I think so.
I think it has to be said. I mean, if John had something which was not a strength, it was that he was not great with scripts and ideas for scripts. He was very much a doer and a maker, and I was very lucky because when I worked on the show, I was working with the new script editor then, Andrew Cartmell, who was, they were like chalk and cheese, he and John. I mean, John was flamboyant, big picture. Andrew was quite reserved, quirky, and an absolutely brilliant script editor. So they worked terribly well together. I mean, John was always incredibly encouraging to us about the scripts, and left us to get on with it, really. And then when we were going, he would make it work. I still have to mention that it is one of the, I still blink at this, but it's actually confirmed by the production diaries on Paradise Towers. I wrote the first drafts of episodes 2, 3, and 4 in 6 days. I still don't believe it.
Wow.
I mean, I had a whole week to do episode 1, and then they sort of commissioned it. I'd written the end of episode 1, not knowing what the hell was going to happen in episode 2, just to get the job. And then they turned, because John had not expected to carry on, the script pile was pretty low, and so I was being pushed forward. But I mean, that primarily I was supported as a writer by Andrew, but John, you know, just always kept his nerve. We were going in a very different direction from the direction before. He never stopped it. He always said, yeah, let's give it a try. And he was a great enabler, I would say, rather than an original thinker. And that's probably why it was so difficult for him after he left Who. If only somebody had given him some projects when he could use that incredible energy and invention and fun, it would have been great. But he was stuck as a one-horse pony. He was a Doctor Who man.
We talked earlier on at the top of the show about historical figures and the idea of JNT as being an historical figure. Chris, this is somebody that you knew from when you were very, very young, both John and Chris, and here we are talking about them as historical figures. But the truth of the matter is, and you know, that the legacy of people who have made music, film, television, or sporting moments, or any of those sort of big cultural touchstones in people's lives, this legacy is a mix of how they are received and perceived and related to, as well as their own lives and the way they conducted themselves with their friends and colleagues, aren't they? What do you feel we can learn from John and Gary's story?
I have a real problem with history and the word legend and all this stuff. We seem to be living in an age where it's, oh, we're making history, or I mean, history is just, you know, as I've tried to explain to somebody in a succinct way, is just the retrospective organization of chaos. In other words, it's easy after the event to say, hey, you know, let's have a ceremony and let's do that. That's rubbish. It's all about the life, you know, when Stephen's talking about, hey, you've got, you know, a week to get this sorted, or you know, the pressure's on. You don't have time, you know. It's like an animal that's got to kind of catch something for its kids to eat. You know, we don't have time. They don't have time to think, hey, I'm making history killing this squirrel. They just don't work like that. So my attitude to it is, you know, John as the life, messy, chaotic, you know, whatever it is, that's what's interesting, and that's what I think comes out of this piece. And if I was asked to write a historical tome about John Nathan Turner, I wouldn't have a clue.
Because it's one thing for us to read
unless it was just going to be full of bullshit, you know.
Well, what I'm saying is, it's one thing for us to read things into fantasy, whether they were things that the writer intended or not, allegories or whatever else, or things that we apply like years, decades later. That's different. But when we're talking about something that is so intimate as a person's life and their day-to-day relationship, and that balance, there's something that we're all going to be able to see in this, and it needn't necessarily be about anything big and creative, but something as personal as the way they related to one another, the way they supported one another, the way they communicated. As I think, did you use the word waspish earlier on, Stephen? You know, just because somebody may be waspish, but just because somebody may appear a certain way, and be quite foreboding or unapproachable almost, it may not necessarily mean that they're a bad person, or that they don't want anybody close to them or near them. That's the kind of thing I'm pointing to.
Well, wasps have had wasps. Yeah, the actual wasp. I love that word. But wasps have had a very bad press up until relatively recently. And they are, they are pollinators and they do a lot of good. And so I don't think the word waspish is so bad, really. But Gary should have it should be Gary Waspish Downie, because nobody mentions the word Gary Downie without saying waspish.
Really?
I think,
well, in my experience.
I was just going to say, going back, I think we should mention, because both Barnaby and I are extraordinarily grateful to Richard Marson, who is who wrote a fantastic biography of John Nathan Turner, warts and all. I mean, I think he gets it all there. I mean, incredibly impressive. It's a very open-minded book. You can go from people who adored John to people who couldn't stand John. It's incredibly fair-minded and open, and he was very, very supportive to us from the start. And for me, I don't know whether for you, Barnaby, I think one of the most exciting things was when Richard wrote to us that he'd actually thought we'd got it. He actually thought we had managed to nail something about John and Gary.
Yeah. Outside, because you're taking all the sort of facts and all the minutiae that he put into that book, but you're then creating something bigger out of it, which Stephen did. But yeah, Richard did listen to it, and he did email and say some lovely things. I do remember ages ago when he started writing this, he wrote this. It's now published by a different company, but the original company, I was supposed to do a biography of somebody else, and the company sent me a screenshot of all of the folders that Richard Marson had for his biography of John Nathan Turner, and said, "There's how you do a biography. That's how much detail you need. Do you still want to do one?" I went, "I don't think so, actually. No, you carry on. It's fine," because this sheer amount, the volume of work and research that he put in, or that and you can see it because it creates a brilliant biography. It's not just let's just grab some press cuttings and write around them, and etc. I mean, it's just extraordinary, and it is a fascinating biography because it explores so much and tells you so much. But the fact that Stephen could take all those moments and then create this sort of realistic relationship that, I mean, it's an assumed 3 years of what happened. It's we weren't there, we don't know, but Stephen knew John enough to be able to do that. I did give the script to somebody that knew John really well, who just wanted to read it, and the first thing he said was that it was almost upsetting because he could hear their voices so well just reading the script, which is great. That's exactly what you want to hear for the writing, and knowing that the actors will be able to bring that into the recording. So that so I mean, Richard Marson, his book is fantastic, and the fact that he endorsed this and liked what we did in the end is a lovely thing.
Well, as a huge fan of not just Doctor Who, but I grew up with the John Nathan Turner era. I'm fascinated by him. I did meet him briefly, a few times, in fact, and he's always had this aura about him. I've always been interested in reading and listening to anything I possibly can about him, and this project in particular. As I make my way through life, and you have your relationships with people or whatever else, it also has that sort of that duality to it. So I'm interested in it in that respect too, and I wonder what I will learn, not just about him, but perhaps about myself too, and about the way to treat others, or how not to treat others. I don't know, but I can't wait to hear it. Obviously, Stephen, you're still very creative, still writing all these years after Doctor Who. You said 35 years ago you first wrote for the show, but what projects have you got coming up in the?
It's breaking up. Maybe it's the thought of the 35 years. I didn't get the rest of the question. Sorry.
What have you coming up? What have you got coming up? What projects have you got coming up in 2023?
Well, I first of all, The other thing I've done this year, which I'm very pleased with, which is also Doctor Who related apart from this, is a book of short stories, which Obverse Press have brought out, called The Wall Scaller and Other Stories, a part of which are Doctor Who related stories. And that was very exciting for me because that's my collected short stories to date. And I think they will be of interest to people who like Doctor Who. At least I hope so. Anyway, so that's my plug done. Along with, I've just recently acquired my own Eagle Moss model of the robot cleaner. So, which is in private place.
The white one.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I can bring it out and show you.
Please do. How could we possibly? Oh, he's skipping off. Look.
That was some skip.
It was. Wow. See, we get a lot of this on this show, Stephen. Since we started doing video tracks, people do this to us all the time. So show us what it is you've got. What did you have for Christmas?
Right. That wasn't for Christmas. That was well, it was. It was. So what have I got coming up? Well, it's sort of stuff under wraps. I've got 2 major projects I'm waiting for the go ahead on, and I don't really want to talk about because it just jinxes
everything.
And I think we did a volume of Paradise Towers related stories for Obverse, and I think we're going to be doing a new one of those. And the
go on, show us your model again, Stephen. Show us your model again. This was Eagle Moss. Wow.
Yes,
all the details there.
They went bust. So wrong way.
There we are.
So these have to be acquired, surreptitiously when they come up. And a very kind friend of mine, Matt West, the original publisher of the J&T bio, located this one for me. And as you can see, it is very big.
It looks big and lethal. I wouldn't want to get on the wrong side of one of those.
It actually looks more convincing than the originals, which look good, but they went at the pace of about, anybody, anybody could have got away from them. And this more here, the way the actors had to, you had to put it there and hold it there. The end of one of the episodes is Sylvester doing exactly that, going, and it's all coming from him. There's nothing.
I bet he loved every single moment of it.
I'm sure he did. Absolutely.
Christopher, you seem to be seizing every opportunity, but what does 2023 hold for you? Can you tell us about anything you've got coming up, anything you're involved in?
Well, there's a couple of things. I know it's the lamest answer in the world, but I'd probably rather not talk about. One of them might just involve Barnaby Eaton-Jones, but I don't want to talk about him. So yeah, I mean, it's something not unrelated to what we're talking about now. This is like charades or thinking of people or spy, isn't it? So I spy with my little eye. No, and so that's one thing. There was a movie I worked on. I started working on years ago. I was originally sought for music. A couple of tracks I recorded quite a while ago, band numbers, so are on this movie. And then I got involved as an associate producer as well. It was an indie film. It's coming out in March. It's called Mercy, directed by Wendy Morgan. And so that's interesting. It's been a while getting it off the ground. I mean, it's finished. But and then of course there's my book, which Barnaby published, and there's going to be an online.
What's your book called? Where can people get it from? And well, make sure all the links are in the show notes and the description anyway. But go and wave it around a bit so people can have a look.
Okay, so this is the pre-order edition, which was personally signed, and it's not going to be exactly like this when it goes online in the new year. It's slightly different because there's 1 or 2 pictures we might have some possible copyright problems with, but that's it. It's called And Then It Was Now, and it's a kind of a ragtag kind of patchwork of my life in no particular order, but it does have an inner logic, which of course is essential to any piece of writing. You can pretty well write the craziest twaddle you like, as long as it has an inner logic. So if my life ever had an inner logic, here it is.
What's that? Sorry, what's that you're waving at us there, Stephen? Is that your new tone?
This is the Wall Scaller and Other Stories, published by Obverse Press, which contains 6 Doctor Who stories. 5 of them never published before. And a lot of the work I wrote for Radio 4, I did short stories that people like Sean Phillips, Bernard Cribbins, Dora Bryan performed them. And there's also because during lockdown, I read the Old Testament, but from the beginning to the end. I left out the begat section, and I left out some of the prophecies, and there was something like 15 descriptions of how to build the Ark of the Covenant. So I sort of cut those, but I read all the way through, and some of the stories are so bizarre. I wrote 6 short stories based on them. I mean, it's absolutely bizarre. I mean, that's the one I
think you like a challenge, don't you, Stephen? This is what it is.
Well, this one was about the fact that in the Bible, the prophet Elisha is going through a village, and the children come out and laugh and mock him because he is bald. So he loses his temper, curses them, and she-bears come out of the woods and eat all the children. Now, this is in the Bible.
That went a bit grim. I wasn't expecting to go there.
It's not a story that is very often talked about, but it's there. And there's so many of these bizarre stories.
But it's a very appropriate place to go, isn't it? I mean, you look at what's happening in the world now. I don't want to get all dark and, about it, but all the stuff that's happening, the war and the pestilence and all these damn things, they're very Old Testament.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, the Old Testament is as good an explanation as any, I think. Complete load of hogwash, but it'll do for me. It'll do for now.
Oh dear. And
ask Barnaby about his plans. I mean,
I was going to say, last but not least, is Barnaby Eaton-Jones, who I know you're in between recording sessions to come just to speak to us now. Where would you even start in boiling down the projects that you've probably got coming in 2023? What can you tell us about?
Well, I'm rewriting the New Testament no, not really.
Someone's got to.
No, I was impressed by the book waving going on. So whilst they were doing that, I felt I should get a book out as well.
Goodies.
So that's still available at all goodies bookshops. No, it's
our punters love the goodies, Barnaby. You'll definitely get a few punters from our crowd.
What's
the premise?
Well, I'm going to read it off the back because it's funnier than I can say. It says there was an idea to bring together a group of remarkable people to see if they could become something more. It didn't work out. In fact, the Goodies Superior Talent Agency is rapidly running out of steam, which certainly isn't going to make Iron Man's life any easier. Clearly, it's time for Graham, Bill and Tim to cut out the middleman, fire up the Trandom, and become heroes themselves. What could possibly go wrong? And it's from the team who didn't quite bring you 50 Shades of Graham, which is a spankingly different book. No, it's an official Goodies adventure. The estate of Tim Taylor and Graham Gardner Bilotti said that I could novelize these audio scripts that we were originally going to do before Tim passed away. And so these are all coming out slowly, and they look like old Doctor Who Target books, and we've purposely done that to evoke nostalgia as well. But
Very nice.
But yeah, so that's still out, and there's a new one coming out in a couple of days' time. So that's quite exciting. But I'm there, as Chris sort of hinted at, there might hopefully be a project for the three of us again. Fingers crossed, if we can, once we've had a little discussion and stuff, it might happen, it might not. I don't know. We'll be discussing it, and we'll see what happens. But so that would be quite exciting if we can get to do that. But aside from that,
It'll be great. Yeah.
Chris says it will happen, so it will happen.
Stay tuned, everybody.
And then there's lots of other stuff coming out. Very much like Chris and Stephen, I've got various things that are going on in the background, but you annoyingly can't talk about them, which is frustrating because you want to be able to share stuff. But yes, you come back to us all in 6 months' time, and we'll all be able to talk about more.
I may have to hold you to that. Me and Him and Who is written by Stephen Wyatt. It stars Peter Noble and Christopher Guard, with sound designed by Joseph Fox, music by Daryl McLean. It's out now on CD from AUK Studios as a limited edition with a digital release coming in mid-2023, it says here, Barnaby. Is that still true?
I think it might even be mid-January 2023.
So quick.
Yeah.
Any day now then, any day now. There's links in the show notes and the video description there as to where you can get it, where you can read more and possibly pre-order, get it in your life via whichever means suits you. For your listening pleasure, gentlemen, thank you so much for your time and the best of luck with this audio drama and everything else that you've got coming up. It's a unique project. I'm just really pleased that you're able to come here and talk to us about it. And on the threshold too of Doctor Who's own 60th anniversary year, Barnaby Eaton-Jones, Christopher Guard and Stephen Wyatt, thank you very much for your company this afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dan.
Me and Him and Who is available on CD and download from AUK. We've got the links in the show notes there and the description to the video track too. Stephen Wyatt's two classic stories, they're still out on DVD. 1987's Paradise Towers and 1988's The Greatest Show in the Galaxy there. And look, please let us know what you think of it all too. But that's the old girl starting up and calling time on another Type 40. I'll be back with another one soon. Of course I will. Look out for that wherever you found this. It could have been at the dedicated home feed for Type 40 over at type40.podbean.com. Maybe we rolled up on the podcatcher of your choice. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music. That's the newest one, isn't it? TuneIn, Google, all those places. And we're still on the Podbean app itself. Catch us streaming here on the Spacebook YouTube channel. This is the world's largest streaming platform. Of course we're here. And we're still on the fabulous Fandom Podcast Network's own master feed, along with all those other shows, loaded up with so many geeky treats for your ears. Never mind on the weekly. It's coming at you on the daily. So please consider a trip sideways in time for more quality shows from the FPN. And maybe you'd like to have your say about all of this. You can do just that. Reach out to us through our social media, Instagram and Twitter at Type40 Doctor Who about this conversation or the audio drama. I'm sure that the guys would love to know what you think about it. Pass it all on. You can reach out to us too through email, type40doctorwho@gmail.com. And if you're feeling really brave and fancy some real-time, extra-dimensional chit-chat, come step into the Type 40 Facebook group and hang out with regenerations upon regenerations worth of Doctor Who fans from the classic era and the new era. And most of all, I think at the moment we're speculating, looking forward to what's to come in all new Doctor Who and that 60th anniversary special that we also know so little about, shrouded in mystery. All we know at the moment is that we've got David Tennant, we've got Catherine Tate, we've got Neil Patrick Harris. Who knows what's about to be revealed for the eyes and the ears there. You can find me on social media as over on Instagram and Twitter as the Spacebook, where I'm wheezing and groaning, ranting and raving about all things geeky, inside and outside of the TARDIS, even real life now and again when I absolutely have to. But yeah, that's it for another one. We always have the time if you have the space here at Type 40. You take care. We'll speak to you again soon. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.